Welcome back to the An Inspector Calls season from Click Revision. Now you have an idea of the background of An Inspector Calls and the time it's set in, we will begin to look at each of the characters in turn in a little more detail. This video will focus on Arthur Birling. We will look at how he's described by J.B. Priestley, his previous relationship with Eva Smith, and his dialogue and action within the play. Arthur Birling is described in the stage directions as a heavy-looking, fairly portentous man, which means he's a little bit overweight, but also that he's the sort of person who constantly tries to impress everyone around him with how great and successful he is. Priestley also describes Birling as having fairly easy manners and being rather provincial in his speech. This suggests that he has a regional accent and is fairly down-to-earth and not snobbish despite being a prosperous manufacturer, which means he owns a factory and he's made a lot of money from it. He's also held political positions on the local council and was Lord Mayor 2 years before the play takes place. He expects to receive a knighthood in the next honours list, which would make him Sir Arthur Birling. So overall he's a fairly powerful man who's well respected in the community. Nonetheless, it's fair to say that Birling isn't a very likeable man, and he could be described as pompous, smug, or arrogant at many points throughout the play. The first line in the play is spoken by Birling, and in it he's boasting to Gerald about how posh his bottle of port is and basically trying to convince Gerald that he's as classy as the rest of the Croft family are. Birling is a domineering personality who likes the sound of his own voice and strongly believes in his own opinions. He's the sort of man who insists on giving a long rambling speech after dinner, even though there aren't many guests at the table to hear it, and this is exactly what he does at the start of the play while celebrating Sheila and Gerald's engagement. Birling's engagement speech begins just as you might expect, toasting the happy couple and describing Gerald as just the kind of son-in-law I always wanted. However, he seems to be fond of Gerald not because he likes him, in fact he doesn't seem to know him very well at all, but because Gerald's father is also a factory owner, and he can see the marriage opening up new opportunities for him. His end goal is to get both families no longer competing but working together for lower costs and higher prices. He describes himself as a hard-headed businessman who has to take risks and knows what he's about, and a hard-headed practical man of business several times, and clearly struggles to leave business discussions out of a family occasion. Interestingly, Birling also uses his speech to make several predictions about the future. Now don't forget that An Inspector Calls is set in 1912 but was written at the end of the Second World War over 30 years later. This enabled J.B. Priestley to use events that had already happened when he wrote the play, but have his characters talk about them as though they hadn't happened yet. Let's have a look at some of the predictions Birling makes in his speech and see how they turned out. Firstly, Birling predicts that the coal miners' strike of 1912, when miners refused to work because of poor wages and dangerous working conditions, would not lead to more strike action and workers winning a fairer deal at the expense of their employers. "Don't worry, we've passed the worst of it," Birling says. However, workers' rights continued to increase for the next 30 years, so he was completely wrong about that. Next, Birling states that there isn't a chance of war. The world's developing so fast that it'll make war impossible. Now, as we all know, the First World War started only 2 years later and lasted all the way up until 1918, so he was wrong about that as well. Next, he brings up technological advances, highlighting the Titanic as a great breakthrough and calling it unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Only a week later, of course, the Titanic sank on its maiden voyage, so he was wrong once again. Finally, Birling claims that in 20 or 30 years' time, there'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere. 30 years after Birling spoke, the Second World War was well underway, so he was completely wrong there too. So as we can see, Birling is absolutely 100% wrong about everything he thinks he knows about the future, and it's clear that J.B. Priestley wanted him to look like a bit of a fool to audiences watching in 1945. However, from the play's perspective, and also from that of J.B. Priestley, Birling saves his wrongest of wrong assessments of the world around him until last, though he describes it as good advice. Let's have a look at this section of the speech. A man has to make his own way, has to look after himself, and his family too, of course, when he has one. And so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. But the way some of these cranks talking right now, you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters, and I've learnt in the good hard school of experience that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. Here, Birling is clearly championing self-interest over ideas of altruism or unselfishness. He openly calls the concept of community or working together with a sense of team spirit nonsense, and labels anyone who believes in it as cranks, suggesting they're wacky or even insane. It's no coincidence that Birling is interrupted at this moment by the doorbell signalling the arrival of Inspector Gould. The inspector will spend the rest of the play attempting to make Birling and his family accept social responsibility and take the less fortunate into consideration, which is the complete opposite message to Birlings' speech here. Arthur Birling is the first member of the family to be questioned about the death of Eva Smith, and was also the first to meet her. The events at the factory that began Eva Smith's spiral into poverty and depression took place in September 1910, and that's 1 year and 7 months before when the play is set in April 1912. The most important thing to remember about Birling's dealing with Eva Smith is that she was fired from her job for standing up for the rights of her fellow workers, who went on strike because they wanted a pay rise from 22 shillings and sixpence a week to 25 shillings. In today's money, that's the equivalent of someone earning around £118 a week and asking for £130. While you might see Eva Smith taking a stand as brave or noble, Birling saw her as a troublemaker and one of the ringleaders in the strike. He fired her from her job because, in his words, if you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth. Back to the present then, and the inspector arrives at the Birling household and questions Arthur Birling first, which makes sense since he's the head of the household. As soon as the inspector enters, Mr. Birling attempts to look important, quickly mentioning how he knows all the police in the town of Brumley and highlighting his powerful positions in the local council. He also attempts to intimidate the inspector into stopping his questions early on by mentioning how he plays golf with the police chief constable. The implication here is that Mr. Birling is trying to subtly suggest that he is too important to be investigated by the police, that his social standing and privilege should extend to him being above the law. He literally feels that the inspector's questions are beneath him, despite the death of a young woman. Birling also continues to repeatedly try to avoid the inspector's questions, calling them uncalled for and officious. In fact, Mr. Birling shows very little sympathy or pity for Eva Smith, who he describes as wretched, and is unable to hide how irritated he is by the inspector's intrusion. Let's have a look at this exchange between Birling and the inspector. This tells us a lot about Birling's character, because he is clearly unable to think beyond his own inconvenience. Most people, when faced with a police officer telling them about the horrific suicide of a young woman, would express some sort of emotion. However, Birling only dismisses the death to turn the conversation back to himself. Furthermore, the stage direction here, that Birling is speaking rather impatiently, clearly shows that J.B. Priestley wanted Birling to appear heartless to the audience and only interested in himself. This idea is also reinforced by Birling's reaction to the name Eva Smith. I seem to remember hearing that name, Eva Smith, somewhere, but it doesn't convey anything to me. Despite his previous dealings with her as an employer, he doesn't remember Eva until he sees the inspector's photograph, at which point he remembers everything about the incidents leading up to her dismissal. As a person, he doesn't remember Eva Smith at all. As a threat to his business, he remembers her with perfect clarity. Nonetheless, when questioned by the inspector, Birling refuses to take any blame for the death of Eva Smith, and maintains this attitude throughout the entire play. He tells the inspector, "I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it?" Again, this is an example of Birling's every man for himself attitude, and how he's unsympathetic towards the rest of the human race. He completely rejects the idea that his actions in 1910 could have in some way led to Eva Smith's death in 1912. In fact, Birling's main concern throughout the play is his social standing, and the risk of the public finding out about his family's connections to Eva Smith. He uses the phrase public scandal 4 times in the play, and is particularly worried that his knighthood is at risk. To Birling, appearance is everything. He describes himself as a public man, and his success largely depends on him looking like a reputable, important member of society. He wants to look to all outsiders like he is a good, upstanding citizen, without actually having to be a good, upstanding citizen. As the inspector implicates each member of Birling's family, he becomes increasingly worried that his public reputation is at stake. He says to his wife, "When this comes out at the inquest, it isn't going to do us much good. The press might easily take it up," suggesting he's worried about the scandal making the newspapers. By the time the inspector leaves, with the knowledge that all his family are involved and that his son has stolen money from the family firm, making him a criminal, Birling does appear to show some remorse for the death of Eva Smith. However, there is little in the rest of the play to suggest that Birling actually feels sorry for the girl. Birling's unhappiness, as prompted in the stage direction, is clearly self-pity. Furthermore, the inspector's response that "you're offering the money at the wrong time, Mr. Birling," is clearly intended to show how far out of whack Priestley believes Birling's priorities are. He approaches the death of an innocent girl and the potential shaming of his family in public in exactly the same way he'd approach any problem in his life, by throwing money at it. Indeed, apart from this small admission of regret, Birling is changed very little by the inspector's visit. After the inspector leaves, he still refuses to accept any fault in the death of Eva Smith. He openly blames Eric for the scandal that is likely to befall the family, and tells him, "You don't yet realise all you've done." It's fair to say that Arthur Birling is being a bit of a hypocrite here. He doesn't spare a thought for Eva Smith or the grandchild he's lost. His only concern is his own public standing. He even says, "Nothing much has happened. Haven't I already said there'll be a public scandal unless we're lucky, and who here will suffer from that more than I will?" Also, Birling's relief when the family unmasks the inspector as an imposter and not a member of the police force is very much focused on the fact that there will no longer be a scandal. He's simply relieved to be off the hook. He says to Eric, "If that had been a police inspector and he'd heard you confess," which implies that the family is going to cover up Eric's criminal activity. Birling is also the main conversation leader in deciding that the inspector's visit must be some sort of hoax, and even goes so far as to try to make excuses for why he was outsmarted. We ought to have seen through it from the first. In the ordinary way, I believe I would have done, but coming like that bang on top of our little celebration, just when we were all feeling so pleased with ourselves, naturally it took me by surprise. Not only can he not accept responsibility for the events of the play, he can't even accept that he might have been outsmarted by another person. He explains the inspector away as probably a socialist or some sort of crank, which takes us full circle, because crank is exactly the same word he used at the start of the play to describe anyone with a sense of community. Overall, despite everything that he sees and hears throughout the play, because he thinks he's gotten away with it, and there will be no consequences, Mr. Birling learns absolutely nothing from the experience. Well, thanks for watching. That's all on Arthur Birling for now. Our next video will focus on Mrs. Birling, but we'd recommend attempting to write a few sentences in answer to each of these questions before you move on. Question 1. What took place between Mr. Birling and Eva Smith? Try to answer clearly and in chronological order, the order everything happened. Question 2. To what extent is Mr. Birling responsible for the death of Eva Smith? Try to link your opinions back to the text. Question 3. How would you describe Arthur Birling? Choose 5 words you'd use and write a sentence or two explaining why you think each description is appropriate.